She was 31 years old, and she had nothing left. Not the house, the bank had taken that. Not the wagon, the liveryman had seized it against a debt her late husband had never once mentioned. Not even the black wool dress she had worn every Sunday since her wedding, because she'd had to trade it to Mrs. Puddicombe's dry goods store for 3 days' worth of flour and dried beans. What Nora Calloway possessed in the autumn of 1887, standing in the wagon-rutted main street of Harlan Crossing, Colorado, was 47 cents in a coat pocket, a canvas satchel containing one change of clothes and her mother's Bible, and enough quiet fury to set the whole of the Front Range on fire. It was Franklin Greer, her husband's business partner, the man who'd smiled warmly at her funeral reception and then filed his claim on the smithing shop before the earth had settled over Elias Calloway's grave, who had reduced her to this. He'd produced a paper. A signed paper, notarized in Denver, establishing that the Calloway and Greer Iron Works belonged in full to the surviving partner. Nora had read that paper 6 times by lamplight. She'd had a lawyer in Pueblo read it too. It was legitimate. It was legal. And it had left her with nothing but 47 cents and a name in a town that no longer had any use for her. That was when she saw the forge. It sat behind the old Harlan Crossing livery, half hidden by a tangle of creosote and dead sunflower stalks, listing slightly to one side like a man who'd had too much to drink. Someone had chalked a price on the firebox door in white letters, barely legible through the rust, 2 bits. 25 cents. For a forge the size of a steamer trunk, cold, and seized up and so eaten through with oxidation that 2 of the boys from the feed store laughed out loud when she asked the liveryman if she could buy it. They said she'd need 6 men and a mule just to move the fool thing. They said it wasn't worth a cup of bad coffee. They said a lot of things, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Nora paid her 2 bits. She hired 1 boy and a borrowed mule. And she hauled that rusted forge to the edge of town, to an abandoned equipment shed she'd talked herself into renting for $1 a month. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that behind the firebox door, sealed inside a cavity built into the forge's iron spine by the man who'd made it, was something that would not only rebuild her life but restore the livelihood of every family in Harlan Crossing that Franklin Greer had spent 4 years quietly and methodically destroying. And it would do it with the voice of a dead man who had trusted no one alive enough to speak it out loud. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Calloway. If you've ever felt like the town you live in has forgotten how to believe in itself, tell us so in the comments. We read every one. She was born Nora Elspeth Haas in the summer of 1856, in a sod house 12 miles east of what would eventually become Fort Collins, to a German-speaking father who had come west to farm wheat and a mother who had come west to follow him and had never quite forgiven herself for the decision. Her father, Wilhelm Haas, was a quiet, methodical man with enormous hands and a gift for understanding machinery, the way gears loved each other, the way a wheel, properly balanced, would spin for what felt like forever on almost nothing. He fixed things for neighbors without being asked and without expecting payment, and the neighbors brought him eggs and salted pork and once, memorably, a young milk cow, because that is how the plains economy worked when money was scarce and trust was abundant. From the time Nora could reach the workbench, her father taught her. Not as a curiosity, not as something to fill her idle hours before she was old enough to marry, he taught her because she was the child who stood still long enough to watch, who asked the right questions, who had inherited, apparently, those enormous useful hands. By the time she was 12 she could read the temper of iron by its color in the heat, the dull red that meant the metal was waking, the bright orange that meant it was ready, the blinding yellow-white that meant you had pushed too far and had better think quickly. She knew how to draw metal into wire, how to upset a bar to thicken its end, how to rivet two plates together so cleanly the joint was almost invisible. Her mother taught her other things. Edith Haas was not, as she sometimes claimed in her more dramatic moments, a woman without practical gifts. She kept the house accounts in a leather-bound ledger with a precision that a Denver bank clerk would have envied, logging every transaction, however small, however informal, in a hand so neat it looked printed. She believed, with a fervor she applied to very few things, that a person who could not account for their own money was a person who was lying to themselves, and she passed this belief to Nora as surely as Wilhelm passed his love of iron. Nora grew up understanding that every piece of work you did had a value, and every value could be written down, and the written down values, added together over time, told you the truth about your life whether you wanted to hear it or not. They were not wealthy. They were not struggling either, most years, which on the Colorado plains in the 1870s was a kind of success that didn't announce itself, but simply endured. The wheat came in well for 6 out of every 10 seasons. The equipment held. The neighbors remained neighbors. And when Elias Calloway rode out from Harlan Crossing in the spring of 1878 to ask Wilhelm Haas if he knew anyone who could repair a cracked bellows housing on a commercial forge, Wilhelm sent Nora, because she was 22 and had fixed 3 such housings before, and because, as he told his wife that evening, there was no sense sending a lesser craftsman when you had the best one available. She fixed the bellows housing in 4 hours. Elias Calloway watched her work with an expression that, in a man with less dignity, might have been called astonishment. He was 33, a blacksmith of genuine ability who had built the Calloway Iron Works from a single anvil and a rented shed, and he had never in his working life seen a woman at a forge doing work he could not himself have improved upon. He told her so. She thanked him and gave him a fair price for the repair and drove the wagon back to her father's house. He came calling 3 weeks later. He came calling the 3 weeks after that. By the fall of 1878 they were married, and Nora had moved to Harlan Crossing, and the iron works had a second set of those large, capable hands to draw on. The years that followed were good ones, or good enough. Elias was honest, steady, and more than willing to let Nora work the forge beside him, which was not a common thing in a town like Harlan Crossing, but which everyone eventually accepted because the work that came out of the Calloway shop was undeniably fine. They took on contracts from the railroad, from the mining operations up in the foothills, from ranchers who needed custom ironwork and were willing to pay for quality. They were not rich, but they were solid. They were respected. Franklin Greer arrived in 1883. He came with a letter of introduction from a business contact of Elias's in Denver and a proposition, capital investment in the shop in exchange for a minority partnership stake. The shop could expand, hire 2 apprentices, take on larger contracts. Elias thought it over for a week and said yes. Nora had misgivings she could not fully articulate, and she kept them to herself, because Elias was a good man and she did not want to be the kind of wife who undermined her husband's judgment without evidence. She catalogued her misgivings in her mother's way. She wrote them down, neatly, in the back of the household ledger, and she watched. The fall came early in 1886. It always did in the foothills, the cold sliding down from the high peaks in September like something impatient, and Elias Calloway began coughing in October with a sound that Nora recognized from the winter her youngest brother had died, a deep, wet sound, like something tearing slowly inside. She sent for the doctor in Pueblo. She made poultices. She sat with him through the nights when the coughing was worst and the candle burned down to nothing in its holder. And the wind came off the mountains and found every gap in the shop house walls. He died in February of 1887, on a Tuesday, with his hands folded on the quilt Nora had made from her mother's old dresses, and the look on his face at the end was not afraid, which was the only comfort she had for a long time after. She had not known about the partnership agreement. That is the truth of it, and it must be stated plainly, she had not known. She had known that Franklin Greer held a stake in the shop, a minority stake, Elias had said, a quarter share, never more than that. What she had not known, because Elias had never mentioned it, and because she had trusted him and because she had not thought to look at the partnership papers themselves, was that the agreement had been renegotiated in the spring of 1885. She found out how it had been renegotiated when Franklin Greer appeared at her door 11 days after the funeral, impeccably dressed for the mud-season cold, and showed her the paper. The renegotiated partnership gave Greer 51% of the Calloway Iron Works upon the death of either founding partner. Elias had signed it. The notary seal was genuine. The lawyer Nora hired in Pueblo looked at it for 2 hours and told her, with genuine regret in his voice, that there was nothing to contest. She spent 2 weeks in the shop house after Greer took possession of the Iron Works, sorting through what was hers and what was now legally his. It was during this sorting that she noticed something Greer had apparently not noticed, or had not thought important. Elias's personal ledger was missing. Not the shop ledger, that was present and accounted for, neat as her mother's housekeeping. The personal ledger, the small red-covered book in which Elias recorded his private observations about the business, the deals he was considering, the calculations he ran when he thought no one was watching. Nora had seen him writing in it dozens of times over 9 years of marriage. She had never asked to read it. It was his private thing, and now it was gone. She could not find it anywhere in the house. She assumed Greer had taken it, or that Elias had destroyed it before he died, or that it had simply disappeared in the way that small important things disappear when a life is upended. She left Harlan Crossing at the end of March with 47 cents, canvas satchel, and a bitterness she was too proud to let anyone see. She came back in September because she had nowhere else to go. The forge was everything it appeared to be from the outside, which is to say, it was a disaster. The liveryman, a decent enough man named Cal Pruitt who felt a little guilty about the laughter, helped her, and the hired boy, a 16-year-old named Marcus Adele who was stronger than he looked, loaded onto a rented flatbed and hauled it to the equipment shed at the edge of Thornberry Road. The shed had belonged to a harness maker who'd moved on to Leadville the previous spring and left the building to accrue in arrears until someone bothered to track him down about the rent. The landlord, an elderly widower named Archibald Foss, charged Nora her $1 a month and looked at her with that particular expression of pity, mixed with mild contempt that she had become accustomed to over the past months, the expression that said, plainly, "What do you think you are doing?" She set up her tools. She had managed to retrieve, from the shop house before Greer changed the locks, her own personal set of hand tools. Her father's swage block, which was hers by inheritance and which she'd brought to the marriage, 2 hammers, a set of punches, a pair of tongs. Everything else she would need to rebuild or improvise. She started on the forge itself the first morning, because you cannot assess a piece of equipment from the outside, and because the first thing a smith does when she acquires an unfamiliar forge is learn its character. She built a small fire in the portable brazier she'd borrowed from Marcus's mother and brewed coffee while she worked, and she worked methodically from the outside in, chipping rust from the iron body, testing the welds at each seam, assessing the bellows chain and the tuyere, the pipe through which the air blast reached the fire pot. The bellows were seized, but not irreparably. The fire pot was in better condition than she'd expected. Someone had at some point banked it with firebrick, which had protected the interior. The exterior shell was rusted in several places but structurally sound. The forge had been neglected, but it had been well made. It had been made, in fact, with a care and intentionality that Nora recognized the way you recognize an accent. It reminded her of work she knew. It was on the 3rd day of cleaning that she found the firebox door. Not the main door, the fire pot door, which she'd already opened and inspected. This was a second door, smaller, built flush with the rear panel of the forge body where the iron was thickest. It was not a feature she had ever seen on a forge before. It was not a feature she had expected. She found it because she was cleaning the rear panel with a wire brush and the rust came away unevenly, and underneath the rust, barely perceptible unless the afternoon light hit the iron at exactly the angle it was hitting now, was the seam of a door. No larger than a cigar box, with a latch pin that had been painted over in the same original black as the body of the forge. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Then she took her smallest punch and cleared the paint from the latch pin, and she turned the pin, and the little door swung open on a hinge that was, somehow, almost entirely rust-free, protected, she realized, by the residual heat of thousands of fires that had never quite let moisture settle in the cavity behind it. Inside the cavity was a small oilcloth packet, tied with a length of braided wire the way you might secure a parcel you expected to be away from for a long time. She set it on the workbench and looked at it for a while longer. Then she untied the wire. The oilcloth contained 3 things. The first was a small red covered Book. Nora recognized it before she'd fully registered what she was looking at, the way you recognize the face of someone you love across a crowded room before your mind has caught up with the knowing. It was Elias's personal ledger. The one she had spent 2 weeks searching for. After the funeral. The one she had assumed was lost. She sat down on the upturned crate she used as a stool in the equipment shed, and she held the red book in her hands for what might have been 10 minutes, and she did not open it yet, because she understood without being told that opening it would change things, and she wanted to be steady when things changed. The second item was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, sealed with a wax impression she recognized as the signet ring Elias had worn on his right hand, a ring whose whereabouts she also had not known. Which she now understood he had used to seal this document and then disposed of separately, so that no one could unseal it by force without her knowing. The seal was intact. The third item was a key. Brass, small, with a number stamped into the bow, 14. She broke the wax seal on the letter. First, because the letter was addressed to her. She recognized Elias's handwriting, the careful, slightly formal script he used for anything he considered important, as opposed to the quick loose scrawl of his working notes. The letter was dated October 1886, 4 months before he died, written in a hand that was already trembling slightly from the illness but was still, unmistakably, his. It read, "Nora. If you are reading this, then I did not find the courage to tell you face to face, or I left it too late, which amounts to the same failure. I am sorry. You deserve better than a husband who hid things, and I have no defense. Except that I was afraid of your anger, which I had earned, and afraid of what knowing would require of you when I was gone. But I kept records. I kept all of it. Because your mother was right about the written down truth, and I knew it even when I wished I didn't. The ledger will explain everything. The key is for the safety box at the First Consolidated Bank in Pueblo, box number 14. Everything I have described in the ledger is documented in that box. Use it as you see fit. I believe in your judgment more than I have ever believed in anything. Forgive me when you can. Your husband, Elias." She read it twice. She folded it and set it down. Then she opened the red ledger. It took her 4 evenings to read the ledger in full, working by lantern light in the equipment shed after Marcus had gone home, reading slowly and carefully the way her mother had taught her to read anything that involved numbers and names. What it contained was a history, a 5-year account, beginning in 1882, of Franklin Greer's activities in and around Harlan Crossing, Colorado, recorded in Elias Calloway's careful, damning hand. Greer had arrived in Harlan Crossing not as a simple investor but as an agent, though not of any legitimate business. He had identified the town in the way that a certain kind of man identifies a small, isolated community that is growing faster than its institutions can keep pace with, a place where contracts were made on handshakes, where deeds and titles were sometimes loosely documented, where a confident man with city manners and a letter of introduction could move quietly from transaction to transaction, pulling small amounts of value from each one, building a web of obligations and encumbrances that would not be visible in any single thread but would, seen whole, reveal a net. He had Done it with the iron works first, the partnership, the renegotiated terms that Elias had signed in a moment of financial pressure and then been too ashamed to tell Nora about, because the terms were humiliating. And because Elias had believed, until near the end, that he would find a way to undo them. He had done it with 3 other businesses in Harlan Crossing, the feed store, which Greer now held a lien against, the lumber yard, whose owner had signed a supply contract with penalties so severe that a single missed delivery would forfeit the property, and the small savings association that the German and Czech immigrant families of the surrounding farms had established to pool their resources for hard seasons, an association whose charter, Elias had discovered in 1885, had been quietly amended to add Greer as a co-signatory on any disbursements over $50. That last item was the one that had moved Elias from shame to fury. He had written it in the ledger in letters larger than his usual hand. He has his hand in the settlers' fund. He is stealing from people who cannot afford lawyers. Elias had spent the last year of his life documenting it. Every transaction, every amended contract, every encumbrance, recorded with dates, names, amounts, and, where he had managed to obtain them, copies of the relevant documents. Those copies were in the Pueblo safety box. He had not gone to the law because he did not trust that the law in Harlan Crossing was not also entangled with Greer, and he had been right about that. Nora would later learn that the county clerk, a man named Atkins, had been receiving $20 a month from Greer for 4 years. What Elias had not lived long enough to do was take the documentation to the territorial authorities in Denver, who were not entangled with Greer, and who were, in fact, actively looking for exactly the kind of evidence Elias had spent a dying year collecting. Nora understood this on the 4th evening, sitting in the lantern light with the ledger on her knees and the oilcloth packet on the bench beside her, and she felt something settle in her chest that she could only describe as a terrible, quiet clarity. The feeling not of anger but of purpose, which is what anger becomes when it has somewhere useful to go. She thought of her mother's ledger. She thought of her father's hands. She thought of the settlers' fund, and the families she had known when she'd lived in this town, the Kupkas. And the Pfizers and old Benedict Holub who'd come from Bohemia with $30 and built a wheat farm through 4 drought years through sheer stubborn will, and she thought about $20 a month going to a county clerk so that a man in city clothes could continue sliding his hand into the till. She got up, banked the lantern, and went to bed. In the morning, she would drive to Pueblo. She had not accounted for Franklin Greer. She should have. That was the thing she acknowledged to herself afterward. She should have known that a man who had spent 4 years building an invisible web would notice when one of the threads began to move. She had been in Pueblo for 2 days when she returned to Harlan Crossing, to find Marcus Adele waiting for her at the edge of town with a look on his face that was trying very hard to be calm and not quite managing it. He told her, quickly and quietly, that 2 men she didn't know had been asking around town about what she was doing in the equipment shed. That Greer had come in person to speak to Archibald Foss about the shed lease. That Foss, who was elderly and not inclined toward conflict, had agreed to terminate the lease, and that the termination notice was sitting on the workbench beside the forge. He's saying the building's needed for other purposes, Marcus said. But it isn't. He just wants you out. Nora took the termination notice from the workbench. She read it. She set it down. How much time does it give me? She asked. 14 days. She stood in the shed for a moment, looking at the forge, the cleaned and partially repaired forge that now represented, she understood, the only piece of working equipment she still technically owned outright in Harlan Crossing, Colorado. The only thing she had purchased with her own money and not been stripped of. Who else knows? She said. About what you found? About any of it? Marcus was quiet for a moment. My father knows something's happening, he said. He said Greer's been in the saloon more evenings this week than usual. Talking to people. He does that when he's nervous, my father says. Buys. Everyone drinks and talks a lot, and everyone goes home feeling warm toward him. Your father is perceptive. He grew up poor, Marcus said, as if this explained everything, which Nora supposed it did. She had not yet told Marcus what was in the ledger or what she had found in Pueblo. She had not told anyone. But she looked at this 16-year-old boy who had helped her move a rusted forge for the price of a fair day's wage and who had, apparently, been watching the town the way her father had taught her to watch iron in the fire, attentive, patient, waiting for the moment when it was ready, and she made a decision. Sit down, she said. I need to tell you some things. What followed was a conversation that Marcus Adele would describe, in later years when he became the kind of man people asked about such things, as the moment he understood that information, properly documented and properly placed, was the most powerful tool a person without money or standing could wield. Nora spoke. Marcus listened. By the end, he was not trying to look calm. He looked furious, which was appropriate. What can I do? He said. I need a writer who won't be noticed, she said. Someone who can go to Denver. He thought for a moment. My cousin Judith rides out to her husband's family in Longmont every few weeks. She could go to Denver instead and no one would think twice. Good, Nora said. Good. And I need the Kupka family and the Hollobs and anyone else with a stake in the Settlers Fund to come to the equipment shed 2 evenings from now. Quietly. No broad invitations. Can I ask what you're going to say to them? I'm going to tell them the truth, she said. And I'm going to show it to them written down. They came on a Wednesday evening, 7 families in all, crowding into the equipment shed with its smell of rust and coal and the sharp clean scent of metal that Nora had spent weeks restoring. They came quietly, the way people come when they are not sure if they are being watched, and they sat on whatever was available to sit on, crates, sawhorses, the edge of the workbench, and they looked at Nora Calloway standing in the lantern light beside the forge, and they waited. She told them everything. She showed them the ledger. She showed them the copies of documents from the Pueblo's safety box, spread across the cleared workbench in the lamplight. She showed them, in her mother's neat accounting style, what had been taken from them and when and how much. The silence in the shed. When she finished was the kind of silence that is not empty but full. Full of calculation, of memory, of the slow, terrible recognition of things that had felt wrong for years but had never quite assembled. themselves into a shape you could point at. Old Benedict Hollub, who was 64 years old and had not spoken more than necessary to anyone since his wife died, said in his still accented English, "The fund." "He has been in the fund." "Yes," Nora said. "How much?" "I can show you the figures." She turned a page in the ledger. Elias tracked it. Over 3 years, the withdrawals made on Greer's co-signature authority total $1,140. Another silence. "My father built that fund," said Anna Kupka, who was 38 and had her father's steady eyes. "He and 4 other men. That was 1879. "I know," Nora said. "I know it was." What happened over the next 3 weeks was not dramatic in the way that the novels of the period liked to describe justice as dramatic. It was not a courtroom scene, not a public confrontation, not a sheriff arriving with manacles. It was, instead, a bureaucratic process that moved with the careful, unstoppable momentum of properly documented truth. Judith Adele rode to Denver. She carried a packet of documents and a letter from Nora addressed to the Territorial Attorney General's office, which was, as Nora had established through careful inquiry in Pueblo, in possession of an open inquiry into a pattern of financial irregularities across 3 counties. The packet Judith delivered contained precisely what the inquiry needed and had not been able to obtain: names, dates, amounts, and a chain of documentation complete enough that a clerk in the Attorney General's office could follow it without any additional explanation. The county clerk, Adkins, was suspended from his position before November. Franklin Greer was served with a formal notice of investigation in the second week of October, and by the end of that month he had retained a Denver lawyer and was spending his evenings not in the saloon buying people drinks but in his office going through papers with the look of a man who is realizing, gradually and then all at once, that the net he thought he had woven around a small town had instead been woven around himself. He did not go to prison. That should be said plainly, because the truth is often less satisfying than the stories we tell about it. He settled, he paid back, through the mechanisms of the territorial process, a substantial portion of what had been taken, and he sold his interest in the Callaway Iron Works as part of the settlement, and he left Harlan Crossing in the spring of 1888 and was not heard from again in that county. The families who had been encumbered had their encumbrances cleared. The settlers' fund received its restitution. It was not complete justice. It was the kind of partial, imperfect justice that the world actually delivers, and it was real, and it was documented, and it held. The iron works came back to Nora. Not as a gift, as a settlement disbursement, which meant it came with a valuation and a process and a great deal of paperwork, none of which she minded in the least, because her mother had taught her that paperwork was just truth written down, and she had always been comfortable with truth. She moved back into the shop house in March of 1888. She hired Marcus Adele as her first apprentice, at a wage she had calculated to be fair and had written into a proper contract, which she kept in a lockbox she purchased from the hardware store and which she had engraved on the lid, at her own expense, with a single word, records. The forge from the equipment shed came with her. She had cleaned it entirely by then, repaired the bellows, re-bricked the fire pot. It stood in the corner of the Callaway Iron Works shop, slightly smaller than the main commercial forge and somewhat worn in its proportions, but solid, the solid, patient solidity of something well-made that has been waiting a long time to be useful again. She never found out who had built it. She had theories. The craftsmanship was older than the forge Elias had run. The shop on, and the design, particularly the hidden cavity behind the firebox, suggested a maker who had built hiding into the object by instinct, as if a craftsman who knew his work would last longer than his secrets might as well put the two together. She thought sometimes that Elias had known the cavity was there, had bought the old forge precisely because he needed it, had stored his ledger and his letter and his key in the iron spine of a thing that no one would look twice at, and then had let it be hauled to the back of the livery, understanding that if the time came for it to be found, it would be found by someone who looked more carefully than most. She thought that was probably giving Elias too much credit for cleverness. But she thought it might be giving him exactly the right amount of credit for knowing her. And so we return to where we began, to a woman standing in a mud season street with 47 cents and a canvas satchel and a quiet fury she had not yet learned to call by its real name, which was purpose. We returned to the laughing boys from the feed store, and the rusted forge listing in the creosote, and the white chalked price that turned out to be the best 25 cents that anyone in Harlan Crossing, Colorado, had spent in a generation. Nora Callaway lived in that town for 30 more years. She expanded the iron works twice. She trained 4 apprentices, Marcus Adele, and after him 3 others, 2 of whom were women. Which caused the expected commentary in which she ignored with the particular patience of someone who has stopped waiting for permission. She served 2 terms on the town's civic council, and she kept records of everything the council did, meticulous records, which she submitted to the county seat quarterly and which had the effect, over time, of making Harlan Crossing one of the best documented small municipalities in the territory. She never remarried. She was not, by temperament, a woman who needed to be half of something in order to feel whole, and she had enough of Elias in the iron works, in the ledger she kept in the lockbox, in the old forge, in the corner of the shop, to feel that she was not entirely without him. The old forge she never sold and never retired. She kept it fired up 2 days a week for smaller, more precise work, hinges, hooks, the delicate ironwork that commercial production tends to neglect. She told Marcus, and later told the others, that a piece of equipment that has lasted long enough to be called ruined is usually just waiting for someone to look at it carefully. She told them, most things people throw away are not broken. They are only underestimated. She told them, the truth, written down, will outlast almost everything else. She told them, on the days when she was in the mood to be philosophical, which were more days than you might expect for a woman who worked with fire for a living, that the things we hide are not always shameful. Sometimes we hide them because we love them too much to leave them where careless hands might reach. She would tap the iron body of the old forge when she said that last thing, with one calloused knuckle, the way you tap a wall to find out if it's solid. It always rang clean. Thank you for sitting with us tonight, and for giving this story the Time it deserved. If you carry the work of someone who came before you, a parent's trade, a grandmother's patience, a skill that was handed to you like a good tool, then you know something of what Nora carried, and we hope this story honored that. Before you go, we have one question for you, and we'd love for you to leave your answer below. What is something that others wrote off as worthless that turned out to hold something you couldn't have anticipated? It doesn't have to be a rusted forge. It can be a conversation, or a place, or a year that felt like a loss. We'd genuinely love to know. If this story found you at the right moment, please share it with someone who might need it, someone who is in the middle of the hard part and hasn't yet found the hidden door. We'll be back soon with another story from the deep and quiet American past. Until next time, stay close.